Alright guys, welcome back to YoSpill and hope you are ready for another video. So, have you ever been on Facebook Marketplace looking through Honda parts and you see a deal come up that you just can't pass by? Well, that is how we got into this video that we are making right now. So, I've seen a K24z7, which I know is a 9th gen motor, pop up, and the guy posted it for $100. That kind of raised a red flag to me, but the simple parts of the K24z7, $100, you can't really go wrong, even if everything is damaged in the motor. So in the description that he posted, he said that the motor was locked up, that the crank wouldn't turn. So I went and purchased the motor, got the motor here. I've pulled all the accessories off. I have pulled the crank pulley off. I have pulled the, well, there is no header. And there is no intake manifold. Didn't have an intake manifold. But when I went to pick up the motor, he gave me a little backstory. So it was in a 2012 9th gen Civic. It was Comtech supercharged, is what he said. He said it had the intercooler brick, and his intercooler brick was leaking, and it put water into the motor, and then the motor locked up. So he sold the supercharger kit, took the motor out, replaced it, sold the car, and I think he bought an FK8 or something like that. So his description of the motor was a locked up motor, but he did leave a competition stage 5 clutch and flywheel on the motor. So even if the motor is completely junk at this point, I have a full comp stage 5 kit for $100. All right, guys, here she is in all $100 of her glory. This is the infamous single exhaust port K24z7 IV Tech, the 2012 through 2015 Civic SI motor. They make right at 200 crank horsepower, 170 wheel torque. This is the motor that kind of nobody likes. They have a lot of problems with them because they say that they can't change the crank signal, so you're not really easy to swap into all the other cars. Everyone makes it sound like it's something crazy to do, but the coils, the placement of the VTC, the placement of everything else on these motors is very similar. I do know the coil packs themselves are different. The intake manifold is a 2-piece, unlike an RSX Type S. But internally inside the motor, besides the crank trigger being on the crank itself and not on the front of the actual housing over here, I don't really see any difference. I've had a couple of K-series apart at this point now, and everything looks very similar. So I'm going to get the valve cover off. I'm going to get all the cams out, the timing cover off. I'm going to throw you guys on a time lapse, and when I come back to you, hopefully, let's pray that the cylinder head is off, there's no damaged valves, the pistons look good, and we can figure out why he said it's locked up. Even though I know it's not locked up, I've turned it over already. It's not locked up. But let's see how good the inside of this motor looks. Well, guys, anytime you buy one of these questionable Facebook Marketplace motors, you know there has to be something wrong with it. So, what the owner told me is definitely not right. It's not even true at all. He knew this motor was probably hurt really bad because it was supercharged. He told me that the brick had a leak in it and the motor seized up. You don't melt the side of a piston and have aluminum stuck to the piston wall if the tune was good and you didn't do something erratic to it. So the plugs and everything look good. So that just means the tune was very lean. And you can see right here on the first piston, it is missing the whole little front edge right here. You can zoom in. You can see the whole front edge is gone. If we go over here to this piston, the front edge is there. If I turn the motor over, you see the sleeve. Nice, clean. Kind of see the hatch marks. This sleeve. Yeah. There's the missing part of the piston. So, this thing definitely was abused and definitely put away to the end of its life. The cylinder head actually looks surprisingly well. The head gasket looks good. Everything in the motor looks really clean. So, I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to finish pulling the oil pan off, pull the oil pump off, and I'm going to pull that piston and rod out and just see if the rod itself is bent. Check the rest of the rods. Of course, I'll get back to you once I get to that. I'll probably throw you guys on another time lapse and get to doing that. But the motor definitely wasn't locked up due to damage from water going through it. It was definitely locked up due to lean condition and melting the side of a factory piston. Surprisingly, nothing broke. There was a little bit of metal in the screen for the VTEC solenoid. There was a little bit of metal in the little front screen that comes off the head for the VTC. But other than that, everything else in this motor looks really good. I'm sure I could definitely get this thing bored to like 88 millimeter, stick some pistons in it, and this thing would run perfectly fine. I'll have to consider that because to run one of these motors in like a EG or something like that, you need to run a standalone because of the different crank trigger. But I do have an EP3 transmission laying around, but I got plenty of other projects to get to before that. So let me flip the motor over, get the rod on, piston out, just to see how bad it is, and I'll get back to you after that. Alright guys, so the GoPro fell over and died. It was running for a while, filming nothing. So I finished tearing this whole thing apart. This is what the inside of a K24z7 looks like. So there's the crankshaft. It has that fancy gear on the bottom. The crank sensor is right there in the girdle. The actual bearings in this motor do not look bad at all. So, if you know most modern 4-cylinders, your cylinder 1 and your cylinder 4 are a little bit leaner than your cylinder 2 and cylinder 3, depending on intake manifold design and everything like that. Well, the way the K-Series is positioned in the car, the cylinder 1 and cylinder 4 either get a lot more airflow or a lot less airflow, depending on the intake manifold design you go with. Apparently, whatever type of supercharger this car had on it did not like cylinder 1 and cylinder 4. So whoever was tuning it should have added a little more fuel. It must have leaned out. Like I said, he told me that it had the intercooler brick break and put water through the motor. I don't see any signs of water. The head gasket looks good. All the valves look clean. There's no like signs of water detonation or damage to the pistons or anything like that. But there is signs of gasoline detonation, and I'll show you right here. So here is the damage. Here is why this motor cost $100. That is cylinder 1. That is cylinder 4. This has a piece of the piston missing. This has a complete hole in the piston. If you flip her around here, you can see straight through into the rod. So this motor, like I said, is a 2012 Civic SI motor that was apparently abused with some boost. You can see the ring land right there in between the top ring and the middle ring is missing. The other two pistons look brand new. The rods, Honda did a great job designing these rods because these things look strong. They're floating pin. Like I said, if anything, I can get this thing bored out to 88 millimeter or 87.5 millimeter. All the SRT4 motors are 87.5. K24s are 87 millimeter. But yeah, this thing definitely had to have some detonation. Had to be able to see that in the tune. Like I said, the crank, there's the crazy trigger wheel that everyone talks about. Mid plate or whatever you call this thing, the girdle. Everything looks fantastic. I don't see any damage. Here's your crank sensor. You can see it's way in there. Doesn't look like any of the other Honda crank sensors. And the block itself is amazingly clean. Thrust washer fell down in there. Looks good as well, which goes right here on the K-Series. You see they look good. But that'll end this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed me tearing apart a 2012 Civic SI engine. And I'm gonna kind of like throw it back together a little bit, put the cylinder head back on it. I'm not gonna put the pistons back in or the oil pump or anything. Save this thing for later, might rebuild it later, depending on what happens with all of the other K-Series cars. But up next for the next Yoast Built video, I wanna get this Neon at least tuned on 10 to 15 pounds of boost. I did do a base map and I posted it on Yoast Built Facebook page. It made like 220 wheel on 10 pounds of boost with like, I think half the timing it had when it was all motor. So that'll be the next video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. As always, like, comment, subscribe, and share the videos if you guys enjoy the content. And until the next one, you guys are the greatest.